So Tibet is this huge region. It is mostly empty. And Mao Zedong decided to invade Tibet in, I think, 1950. Yeah, early 1950s he invaded. And the Chinese were doing very badly in the invasion of Tibet. Such a vast territory. The supply lines, logistical lines were overstretched. The Chinese were starving. They did not have food. So what happens? Mr. Nehru supplies them with rice.
During the war?
During the invasion of Tibet.
Okay,
the attempted Chinese invasion of Tibet. Mr. Nehru sent rice to the Chinese soldiers. That is why they were able to conquer Tibet. You can look it up. I'm not inventing this story. It's all
Chini, bye-bye.
Yeah. When the British left, if they left behind a unified subcontinent, and if India gave access to Russia to the Indian Ocean, it was game over for the West. Then India will become on the side of the USSR, and there will be a huge coalition and a very powerful coalition, and it will give Russia, for the first time in its history, access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. So they wanted to anyhow prevent this from happening. A unified India would not listen to Britain. So the British created a fake artificial nation, divided on the lines of religion, a small nation that will always feel threatened by India if you teach them right things, and they will always be pro-West, pro-British, and that's why this country, this fake artificial nation, temporary nation was created. And if you look at Pakistan's history, it's always been pro-UK, pro-West, and the UK has always been pro-Pakistan. Even today it is pro-Pakistan. Even today the US is pro-Pakistan. This is the geopolitical reason why Pakistan was created. All this, what we are taught, this freedom struggle and the Do Qaumi Nazariya, two nation, three theory, this is all, it's all cosmetic paint that has been applied to the real reasons why Pakistan was created. So Russia, see, every nation looks out for its own national interest. Every nation prioritizes its national interest over everything else. These are the principles of Vishnugupta Chanakya, and we have to understand that. We are from the land of Vishnugupta Chanakya, but we are so delusional and we are so naive. We think Russia is our best friend. There are no friends in geopolitics. There are temporary enemies and there are temporary allies, but everything is temporary. Please read the Arthashastra. Read what our great Guru Shri Vishnugupta Chanakya told us. The most naive population I see in the world today is Indians. That too coming from the land of Vishnugupta Chanakya. Israel is not our friend. Israel is cooperating with India because it suits them. They stand to gain money.
Welcome all to Anvikshiki YouTube channel. ये हमारा फर्स्ट वीडियो है और हमारे साथ थे अभिजीत चावड़ा सर. It was a wonderful experience and we were so fortunate to have him for our inaugural edition. 90 plus people, especially youngsters, attended this event. ये हमारा फर्स्ट वीडियो था, तो प्लीज थोड़ा सा हम पे इजी जाना और कुछ भी फीडबैक हो उसको कमेंट में जरूर लिखना. एंड ऑल्सो रिमेंबर टू लाइक, शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब. अब चलते हैं वीडियो पे.
बिल्कुल भी उम्मीद नहीं थी कि इतने सारे जन पहले ही एडिशन में आ जाएंगे. तो आन्विक्षिकी विचार मंच, ये नाम आन्विक्षिकी, ये मुझे विजन इंडिया फाउंडेशन, जो अभी राष्ट्रम नाम से जाना जाता है, उसके एक पॉलिसी बूट कैंप में मुझे एक प्रोफेसर मिले थे. तो उनने मुझे ये बताया था कि आन्विक्षिकी का मतलब होता है साइंस ऑफ इंक्वायरी या स्पिरिट ऑफ इंक्वायरी, या फिर और एक तरीके से बोल सके तो इन्वेस्टिगेटिव स्पिरिट. तो यहाँ हम उसी के लिए एकत्रित हुए कि हम कुछ जाने, एक हमारी एक क्यूरोसिटी रहे चीज़ों को जानने की, और इसी तरीके से हम आगे बढ़ना चाहते हैं. तो लेट्स स्टार्ट. यहाँ पे हमारे साथ आज है अभिजीत जी ऑफ क्लैन चावड़ा. इनके लिए क्या बोलूँ, मतलब इतनी सारी चीज़ें, द रेंज ऑफ स्पेक्ट्रम इज़ सो वास्ट. ये प्रोफेशनली थियोरेटिकल फिजिसिस्ट है. हॉबी वाइज हिस्ट्री में बहुत रुचि है, तो इतना बुक्स पढ़ा है, इतना सारा स्क्रिप्चर्स पढ़ा है कि ही कैन बी एक्चुअली कॉल्ड अ हिस्टोरियन. एंड और उसी वजह से जियोपॉलिटिक्स में ये एक एक्सपर्ट भी माने जाते हैं. सो ऑन टू यू नाउ अभिजीत जी. अच्छा, बाय द वे ही ऑल्सो हैज़ अ यूट्यूब चैनल बाय द नेम ऑफ अभिजीत चावड़ा. वो बताने की ज़रूरत नहीं है, बट because it's an introduction. And Ask Abhijit show is where we all see him. So on to him. So first question for you is, what is geopolitics?
Hello. Yes, sir. Thank you so much for the introduction, and nice to meet you all. Nice to see you all. Great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So geopolitics is सबसे पहले मैं क्षमा चाहूँगा, मैं इंग्लिश में बोलने वाला हूँ. Please excuse me. I'm more comfortable in English. So geopolitics is the struggle for world domination, essentially. Geopolitics can be thought of as a sport. आप sport खेलते हैं. So geopolitics is the biggest sport in the world, a sport in which the objective is to win the entire power and resources of the world. And it's a sport in which you make up the rules as you go. Whoever gets more powerful can make the rules as they want. So these days we have the so-called rules-based world order, which the Americans talk about. It is actually the whims-based world order. It is the whims and fancies of the Americans, but they call it the rules-based world order. So whoever is dominant decides the rules. So that is what geopolitics is. It's about resources, it's about power, and it's about control of the world.
So, because if you see our topic, it says history of Russia, China, and Pakistan. So, how does history and because I have written here geopolitical special, but we are talking about history. So,
yeah, see, in geopolitics, we have to understand history. Geopolitics is about, it's about control of power and all that. But to understand what's happening, you have to look back in time. You cannot see what happened right now and decide what's happening and why is it happening. We have to understand the root causes of why certain things are happening right now. And to understand the root causes, we have to look at a nation's geography and you have to understand the nation's history. Every nation has a certain character. Like every individual has a certain personality, certain character, which is more or less constant from birth to death. Similarly, every nation, every culture has a certain personality, certain character. And every nation, if you understand that, and if you understand their past, if you want to truly understand a person, you have to look at their past. If you want to marry your daughter or your son to somebody, you have to look at the family's past, right? Similarly, to understand where a nation is going, we have to see where it came from. And that's why history is so important. It's about causality, it's about cause and effect. It's about the sequence, the chain of cause and effect. They teach us history in the sense of memorizing dates and names, but they don't teach us the cause and effect sequence. If you understand why things happened, then you don't have to memorize anything. Then it becomes fascinating. So that's why history is so important to geopolitics. I never set out to learn geopolitics. I was simply interested in history, because history, for me, I never studied textbooks from school. I studied the books from elsewhere, because I was fascinated, I was curious. For me, it was more interesting than any novel, you know. So that's how I saw it. And then after many years, I realized I understand geopolitics because I understand history. So that's how it happened.
fantastic answer. So that connects the topic to the special of the day. So now we move on to the topic. So Russia, history of Russia. Now, as you said, their past, their behaviors, and what has been going on, the popular thing going on with Russia right now. So, what is their history? What is their actual core behavior? That's what we would like to know.
Right, Russia is a fascinating country. It's a nation with which we have had a lot of a very strong and significant relationship since 1947, especially India-Russia ties. We always speak about that. So, and Russia is very important nowadays because of what's happening in the Ukraine region, the Ukraine conflict. So we have to understand, people would like to know why this is happening and what are the causes. And to understand the causes, we have to understand the history of Russia itself. So let's go back in time. I typically go back 1,000 years. This time I'll go back 2,000 years. So the people of Russia, there is a certain ethnicity called the Slavic people. Okay, the Slavic people. The Russians are the main Slavic group. It's a group of languages and it's a certain culture. So the Russians are Slavic people, the Ukrainians are Slavic people, the Serbians, Croats, Bosnians, Czechoslovakians, Poles, Slovenians, all these peoples are the Slavic peoples. They're the same overall ethnicity, and they speak a group of languages which are overall called the Slavic languages. Like we have a bunch of languages in India which everybody can understand more or less. Similarly, Slavic languages are also more or less mutually intelligible. So the history of the Slavic people goes back at least about 2,000 years. In Roman chronicles, there is a mention of what seems to be a Slavic tribe or ethnicity. So it seems to go back about 2,000 years. Then the Slavic people, they typically lived around northern and eastern Europe, northeast Europe. I'm talking about the boundary of Europe and Asia, the imaginary boundary. Around that place they always have lived. Around 900 AD, you had something called the Confederation of the Rus people. So the Rus people were a group of Slavic tribes who happened to be ruled by a group of Vikings called the Kievan Rus. So these Vikings were actually Scandinavian people. They were the leadership of the Slavic people, and they were called the Rus. That's why this Slavic group came to be known as the Rus. Their capital was Kiev. They were called the Kievan Rus. Their major ruler was, his name was Grand Prince Vladimir. The Ukrainians call him Volodymyr, the Russians call him Vladimir. He was the Grand Prince Vladimir, and he was the Rus leader of the Kievan Rus. The capital, original capital of the Rus people is Kiev. Okay? Today it's the capital of Ukraine, but it's the original capital of the Rus people. Then the Kievan Rus became a very prosperous community. They had these trade networks. This is in the 10th, 11th, 12th century AD. About 800, 900 years before today. They had a big trade network. They used to trade with various parts of Europe and with the Byzantine Empire, all that. Byzantine Empire is in Istanbul, Constantinople, that region, yeah. So the Slavs and the Rus were doing very well. Then in the 13th century, you had a terrible event, which was the Mongol invasion. The sudden rise of the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, and Genghis Khan's descendants went on to conquer Russia. And until the late 14th, 15th century, the Rus were ruled by the Mongols. It was a very tough time for the Rus people. They call it the Mongol yoke. They were under the Mongol yoke. And the Mongols instituted lots of reforms and changes in the administrative structure. It became more militarized. It became more formalized. There were some progressive changes also. You can say, let's not go into that. But yeah, it was a period of Mongol rule for about 2 to 3 centuries. Then, with the decline of the Mongol Empire in the late 14th, 15th century, around that time, there was a resurgence in the rule of the Slavic people, and it all came with Ivan III, who defeated the Mongols and re-established sovereignty and independence of the Rus nation or republic. The capital was now changed to Moscow from Kiev. Okay, so it now shifted to Moscow. Then Ivan III's grandson, who was named Ivan the Terrible, he created a massive empire. Okay, so this was a massive empire. This is the first time the Russians become a major global or geopolitical power. They become a major North European power. Europeans always saw the Russians as outsiders, as Easterners, not white but Asiatic people, because they had mixed ethnicity by this time with the Mongols and all that, mixed blood and all that. So you have the beginning of the Russian Empire under Ivan III, then Ivan the Terrible. At this time, this region in the south of Russia, adjoining the Black Sea region, the Russians gave it the name of the borderlands. And the word for borderlands in Russian is Ukraina. Ukraina. So they called that region as the buffer zone between the Russian Empire and the various European nations. It was called the borderlands. It was a Russian region, Ukraina. All right? That's where Ukraine begins. And Ukraine is definitely 100% Slavic. It is definitely a descendant of the Kievan Rus of 1,000 years ago. That's Ukraine. So you have Ivan the Terrible, who established a great and very brutal empire. Then you have Peter the Great in the 17th century, I think. Then you had Catherine the Great in the 18th century. These people, they tried to transform the Russian society into something that was more Eurocentric, more westernized, more modern in their opinion, because Russians were kind of primitive and more Asian in character until that time. So that is under Peter the Great, who transformed Russia into a major maritime nation. And then there was the expansion of Russia into the east. Today, if you see the map of Russia, where's the map? Where's the map? Okay, can you please open the map? I'll show the map. Okay.
Wait a second.
So let's take a look at the map, because it always helps us to visualize things. Okay, here we are. So today, if we see the map, we see this enormous nation called Russia. It stretches from Europe all the way into the far east of Asia. During the time of Peter the Great, Russia was still very much concentrated around Moscow, and it was more or less in the European region. Then Russians started expanding eastwards because of a simple reason, the fur trade. This entire Siberian region and North Asia region is extremely abundant in all these furry animals like ermines and minks and seals also and all that. and the fur trade was very lucrative, and nobody else in Europe was willing to go into those harsh, cold environments. So the Russians started expanding eastwards, and eventually by the late 19th century, they had conquered all of northern Eurasia, and they had even taken over Alaska. So Alaska was a Russian possession until the mid-19th century. Okay, so that's how Russia became so big. It was all a process of conquest by force. It was not voluntary. There are lots of people who live in this region, the vast region of northern Asia, who are essentially Turkic peoples and Mongolic peoples, Tuvan peoples, Aleutian peoples. They are not Russians. But today their primary language is Russian because of the process of Russification. The Russians imposed their language and culture on these people. That's what happened. So by the late 19th century, by the mid 19th century, by the 1850s, Russia is this enormous expanse of territory. And at that time, in the Crimea region, it was the Cossacks who were mostly living there. The Cossacks were a semi-nomadic tribe who were Russified by the Russians. And this region, once again, was just called Ukraina, the borderlands of Russia. And then what happened is that we had the expansion of the British Empire. We know the British conquered India, and they were also fighting for influence in Central Asia. And this came to a head in the Crimean War in the 1850s, which the British won. And the Russian Empire was then in a state of crisis. As a result of that, they had to sell off Alaska to the Americans. So Alaska is now a part of America. The Russians sold it for a very small amount. They thought there is nothing there. Today there are enormous reserves of coal and gas and gold in Alaska. The Russians did not know it. So that is what happened. So then you come to the 20th century. In the 20th century, we had the Russian Revolution 1917, in which the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas, was ousted, and eventually he and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks. Stalin, at the time it was, what is his name? Lenin, was it? Yes, Vladimir Lenin, of course. Yeah. So that was the Bolshevik Revolution, in which the entire system of the Tsarhood was abolished, and Russia came under, Russia became the USSR. Russia became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And the whole new system was established, communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. Then you had the First World War, the Second World War. The Bolshevik Revolution happened in the middle of the First World War. In the Second World War, the USSR lost at least 27 million men in the war against the Nazis. It is the USSR that defeated the Nazis. It was not the US. It was the USSR that defeated the Nazis at the expense of oceans of blood.
General Winter.
General Winter actually was the punishment for the Nazis. General Winter did not defeat the Nazis. He was the punishment for them not taking Moscow. It was the Russians who fought and ground down the Nazis, and then Winter came and ruined everything. Rasputitsa, we'll talk about that. Yeah. So that is what happened in World War II. At the end of World War II, the world was divided into two systems. One was the democratic liberal system of the West, the US. The US was the winner of the World War II on the western side, and Russia had won on the eastern side. Russia was able to come out of the ruins and the disaster of war and establish an enormous industrial base, and in just a short amount of time, it was able to establish itself as a genuine superpower. Incredible achievement that nobody can deny, right? So that's what happened. Now, Joseph Stalin is in power, and Stalin's rule was very, very, very harsh, very brutal. There were horrible famines. There was all kinds of repression in Russia. Lots of people were executed. Purges, horrible purges. There was the great Holodomor famine in Ukraine at the time. There was a complete disaster and all that. During Stalin's time, for administrative reasons, this Russian region called Crimea, where is Crimea? Here is Crimea. It is this peninsula in the Black Sea. Yeah. So during Stalin's time, he arbitrarily assigned this region to the Ukraine SSR, just for administrative purposes. This has always been a Russian-speaking and ethnically Russian region, but Stalin, for administrative purposes, made it part of the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic, which was like a state of the country. Then we know what happens. Eventually Russia loses the Cold War. In the early 1990s, the USSR breaks up under the leadership of the great Mr. Gorbachev. His policies of perestroika and glasnost accelerated all this. So USSR breaks up. Ukraine and various other states in Central Asia, etc., they declared their independence. Crimea remains a part of Ukraine, even though it was never Ukrainian. Yeah. Then there is an agreement between the Russians and the West that essentially is a deal for the denuclearization of Kazakhstan and Ukraine in exchange for NATO giving a commitment it will not expand eastwards. So NATO was the American-led alliance in Western Europe, and the Russian-led alliance was the Warsaw Pact. So essentially what happened is that the Americans gave an assurance to the Russians that we will not expand NATO eastwards, and please allow Ukraine to become independent and take back the nuclear weapons. That was the kind of agreement, and immediately in the 1990s, as soon as this happened, the Americans started expanding NATO eastwards. NATO is essentially an instrument of the US. NATO is nothing but a proxy of the US. The US has two proxies in Europe. One is NATO, the second is the European Union. In both these coalitions, the US is the true dominating partner. The people think of Europe as a nation, as a region that is dominated by France and Germany. The truth is that the only genuine power in Western Europe is the United States. And it has been so since the end of the Second World War. Germany is under permanent US occupation since 1945. The German Constitution was written by the Americans. It was accepted without protest by the Germans. Italy has been under US occupation, permanent US occupation, military occupation since 1945 until today. So is the case with Japan and South Korea, 1950s, and so on and so forth, right? South Korea also.
So, but South Korea and Japan, they both are east. So Russia won the east, and still why US gets to control them?
Let's come to that. Let's finish this one. So what happens is that the Americans broke the promise immediately. Slowly they started expanding NATO eastwards, and now they reached Ukraine in 2013, 2014. There was this revolution, which was nothing but a US engineered coup, the so-called Euromaidan revolution, in which the democratically elected government of Ukraine was ousted illegally, unconstitutionally, and a US supported puppet regime, Mr. Poroshenko, was put in power. Eventually, now it is Mr. Zelensky. So that's the deal. That's why this conflict happened. Now let's go back to, like your question said, about Japan and Korea. So what happened there? Why is that also the case? So if you go to Japan today, there are more than 130 permanent US military bases on Japanese soil. In other words, Japan is not a free nation. Japan is under foreign occupation since 1945. No one realizes this. The Japanese constitution was written in 1945 by American generals. From 1945 until today, not a single word has been changed. This is not a democracy. It pretends to be a democracy. There was only one leader in Japan who had any standing, and he is dead. Yeah? Very strange. So yeah, that's what happened in Japan. So what happened is that in 1945, the Americans tested 2 nuclear devices on the Japanese civilian population. Yes? And as a result, the Japanese government was forced to surrender. Otherwise, there would be more deaths. The Americans took over Japan, established a whole network of military bases. Russia won the East. So what happened? There are these islands over here called the Kuril Islands, okay, right next of Hokkaido. The great northern Japanese island is Hokkaido, which is in the screen right now. And just off the north of Hokkaido, you have the Kuril Islands. This one, Kunashir, and so on and so forth. All of these islands were taken over by Russia. The Russians would have wanted to take over Japan also, but the Americans were already there. So they came all the way south up to the Kuril Islands. And this is now a disputed, it's a territorial dispute between Russia and Japan. So that's what happened there. The Russians won the Kamchatka Peninsula. They won the Sakhalin Island. They even, if you go back in history, they even took over parts of Manchuria, which the Chinese claim. The port of Vladivostok is right next to North Korea. So the Russians have major territorial gains in Eastern Asia. They won this region, but they could not take over Japan. Then you had the Korean War in the 1950s, which was essentially a proxy war between the communist powers and the so-called democratic powers of the US. China and the USSR wanted to take over the Korean Peninsula. The Americans intervened. Eventually there was a stoppage of war. It was not an official ceasefire. And that's how you have the divided Korean Peninsula between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is a Chinese puppet now. Okay, it is entirely controlled by China. It is beholden to China. South Korea has, I don't know how many, maybe dozens, maybe more than 100 American military bases permanently stationed on their territory. South Korea is in the same situation as Japan. It is under permanent US military occupation. That's what happened.
And sir, any ancient Indian-Russian history which gives us the naturalized tag to it?
Right. So they have discovered idols of Indian gods and goddesses in the depths of Russia. I don't remember which part of Russia it was. It was so if you go to Azerbaijan, there's a city called Baku. Azerbaijan was part of the USSR. In Baku, there is a fire temple which is used by the Hindus as well as Zoroastrians of the region. Historically, it was used by them. Now, Azerbaijan is very much Islamic country or whatever. But yeah, in the past, there was a presence there. But north of Azerbaijan, in Russia proper, in some village, I don't remember the name, they discovered a Vishnu idol, a murti of Lord Vishnu that dates back to in the first millennium AD, like before 1000 AD. Yeah, so there has been a presence of dharmic culture in Russia. There have been long ties. Today there is a massive Buddhist Sangha in Russia, official Buddhist clergy in Russia. The Buddhist influence in Russia dates back to the Mongol times. The Mongols themselves practiced Tibetan Buddhism. Tengrism and Tibetan Buddhism.
Okay, they both are different.
Yeah, they are both different. Okay. Tengrism is a polytheistic belief system. It's very similar to Hinduism. Okay. Yeah, but eventually they also took up Buddhism via Tibet because of the Tibetan influence, and then they spread that across Russia. So that's how Buddhism entered Russia. So there's a very rich history there.
So I think that's where we come to know a lot about Russian history. Now we move on to China. Lots of revelations because I have seen your videos. But yeah, so please take over.
Right, China is a whole different cup of tea. So if you think about the history of India, just going by facts, not by stories, according to the hard facts, archaeological evidence, India's civilization dates back at least 10,000 years. The oldest archaeological site in India that has been actually excavated is Birrana in Haryana. It has been carbon dated to about 9.5 thousand years before today. And there are more than 2,000 unexplored archaeological sites along the dry riverbed of the Saraswati. So if you go and explore there, you will find sites, archaeological sites that are way older than Birrana, that is guaranteed. So India's culture, India's civilization is unbroken, and you will find unmistakable evidence of cultural continuity in all these archaeological sites, which means the same culture has been persisting for 10,000 years in different forms, but it is the same culture, the same core culture. So Indian civilization is at least 10,000 years old. Now, the other great civilization, today there are two civilization states. One is India, one is China. The other great civilization is China. They are about 3,000 years old. If you want to be charitable to them, they are about 3,500 years old. That's how old China is, right? And if you look at the founding myth of China, the mythical founder of China is the great yellow emperor, dragon emperor. He comes from the west of China. So he was not Chinese. He came from west somewhere. And he brought culture and civilization and all that order into China. So China is about 3,500 years old, maximum. They have undergone a lot of turmoil. And they have been under Indian influence for at least 2,500 years. So the great Chinese diplomat and statesman Hu Xi wrote that India for 2,000 years completely dominated China without sending a single soldier across the border. What this means is that the Chinese were so enamored with Indian culture once they discovered it that they used to send ambassadors and embassies to India requesting Indian kings and queens and emperors to send scholars to China to translate Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. And lots of these scholars from India went there. There were even wars between various Chinese kings for hosting an Indian scholar. So there was this guy called, what was his name? No, that's later. I forget the name. His mother's name was Jeevasena or something. A very, very famous Indian scholar who was half Kashmiri and half Khotanese. So he was in China. And
Xuanzang.
Not Xuanzang. The Xuanzang was Chinese. Yeah, so I forget the name, okay, because but the Chinese went to war for him. There were two different Chinese kingdoms, both wanted to host him. So they went to war with each other, and eventually one of them took this guy hostage and they forced him to marry and have children there. Very, very strange stories, yeah. So the Chinese were deeply, deeply impressed with Indian culture. They were so impressed with Indian culture. See, the Chinese, what do they call themselves? They call themselves the Middle Kingdom, right? China has historically called itself the Middle Kingdom, the middle of the earth, the center of the earth. The name for India was Tianzhu. Tianzhu means the center of heaven.
Okay.
The Chinese name for India was Tianzhu, the center of heaven. They called themselves the center of earth, but India was the center of heaven. That is how highly they regarded India, and that's how deeply influenced they were by Indian culture. So many Indian pilgrims, Indian Dharma gurus went there. For instance, there was a king whose name I don't forget. I don't remember Chinese names very easily, but he started a monastery for an Indian guru whose name was Buddha Bhadra. So Buddha Bhadra had gone to China for the purpose of translating Sanskrit sutras into Chinese. He spent many years doing that. Eventually, he passed away. Then the Chinese requested India to send a different monk, a different guru, and the Indians sent a guy called Bodhidharma to this place. So this monastery that was established for the sake of Buddha Bhadra eventually became Bodhidharma's monastery. It's now called the Shaolin Monastery. It is where Buddha Dharma taught the Chinese a yoga-based martial art, which is now called Kung Fu. So Kung Fu originates in India, right? And so much more in Chinese culture has originated in India. China has always been an imperial system. The people of China have typically practiced Buddhism, but the emperors and the ruling class, they typically practice Confucianism or Taoism, a mixture, some kind of balance between Confucianism and legalism. Legalism says that the emperor is the god and whatever he says is the law. Confucianism is a more soft kind of thing. It says that there should be emphasis on family values and all that, but both are atheistic in nature, legalism as well as Confucianism. Confucianism, there is no god in Confucianism. Confucius, yes, Confucius is the guy who started that. So the rulers of China have always had this atheistic mindset. The people of China, even today China has the world's largest Buddhist population, practicing Buddhists. But the rulers have always had this more hard-nosed mindset. So China has had many, many dynasties in the past 2,500, 3,000 years. Some of these dynasties have been conquest dynasties, which means it is foreigners who conquered China and ruled China. In the 8th century, the Tibetans conquered China and took the capital and installed a puppet emperor in China. Tibet once conquered China. Then what happened is Tibetans became Buddhist, and then they became all dharma, all what ahimsa and all that stuff. Yeah, so Buddhism was kind of, it was not very good for Tibet overall. So China has had many, many dynasties. One of the great dynasties of recent times was the Yuan dynasty, which was a conquest dynasty. It was the Mongols who were ruling China. Yes. So it starts with Shri Chinggis Khan, the great warrior for peace. Yeah, he conquered China for the sake of peace, and he conquered China twice. He took Beijing twice, Chinggis Khan. His grandson Kublai Khan became the first Mongol emperor of China. He established the Yuan dynasty, which is a Chinese dynasty of Mongol origin, and they backdated the first Yuan emperor to be Chinggis Khan, but it's actually Kublai Khan. So the Yuan dynasty lasted for a while, slightly more than a century, and during the Yuan dynasty's time, their soldiers captured large parts of Asia because the Mongols were great conquerors, they were unstoppable. So during the time when a Mongol emperor was ruling China, the Mongols captured lots of lands. Today the Chinese claim that the Yuan dynasty was a Chinese dynasty, and all these conquests legitimize our territorial claims on other nations, even though this is a dynasty that had itself conquered China. By which logic Mongolia should own China actually today. Yeah. So that is the convoluted logic that the Chinese use. Then you had the various other dynasties, and then in the in the early 19th century, you had a civil war in China. There was a Japanese occupation of Manchuria, Manchukuo. They actually did much worse. The Japanese, the one blot on the history of Japan is their treatment of the Chinese civilians in the run-up to Second World War. Horrible, horrible. That is a stain they can do nothing about. Especially what they did in Nanjing. That's a different story. I'll not talk about it because it's too ghastly. So yes, in the early 20th century, the last Chinese dynasty fell. Then there was a civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists. Eventually, the communists took over. The Kuomintang had to escape to Taiwan Island, where they still essentially rule. So Taiwan is regarded by the Chinese as a renegade, runaway province. And Mao Zedong was able to prevail in the Chinese civil war after a horrible civil war, lots of bloodshed. They took over China. So that now we are coming into the modern history, right? Then India became independent. It was a transfer of power from one set of crooks to another set of crooks. So the set of crooks who were ruling India, the great Shri, Mr. Nehru ji and so on, yeah. So Mr. Nehru becomes Prime Minister of India. India has always had an expanded sphere of cultural and civilizational influence. Indonesia was always culturally Indian until very recently. Thailand, Burma, they were called Suvarna Bhumi during the times of the Mauryans. Even Ashoka's time, it was called Suvarna Bhumi. Today, the major airport in Bangkok is called Suvarna Bhumi Airport, right? You go there, there is a big tableau of Samudra Bandhan if you go there, right? So they still value their Indian heritage and culture. Indonesia is a Muslim nation, they still value their Indian heritage. They still have strange names like Muhammad, Vishnu and all that. But they still try to keep it alive. Muhammad Vishnu, I mean, what the hell is that? So they try to keep it alive. There is still a lot of Indian influence in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, all those places. Yes, there was this great empire called the Champa Empire, which lasted 1900 years in Cambodia and Vietnam. What is now called the South China Sea has always been called the Champa Sea. Always. That is the correct name, the Champa Sea. The Champas were, it was an empire. It was a great thalassocratic, means maritime empire. And they were Shaivites. This was a Shaivite empire.
Pallavas and Cholas.
Yes, they were for a time vassals of the Cholas because the Cholas conquered all of Southeast Asia up to the Philippines, right?
Angkor Wat in Cambodia.
Angkor Wat is in Cambodia.
Cambodia. Yeah.
So all of this is tangible evidence of the great Hindu past, of the great Indian past of all this region. Similarly, Mongolia was very much Indic through Tibet, and then you had Tibet. Tibet was, for the longest time, part of India's extended sphere of influence. Tibet is part of the Indosphere. Their culture is 100% Indian. It obviously has a very distinctive local flavor. You go to Ladakh, there is Indian culture, but it is Ladakhi Indian culture. You go to Kerala, you will see Kerala's Indian culture. Similarly, you go to Tibet, you will see very, very beautiful, distinctive Tibetan flavored Indian culture, which is Vajrayana Buddhism of the Tibetan variety. So Tibet should always have been under India's protection. After 1947, the great, magnificent, magnanimous Mr. Nehru comes to power. And what he does, he knows what's happening. Sardar Patel had written about this. The Chinese they have their eyes on Tibet, on Ladakh and other places. Mr. Nehru disregarded that.
Sir, can you show Tibet how huge it is? Like we never used to share borders with them, so.
So Tibet is this enormous plateau north of the Himalayas. In ancient times, this region was called Uttara Kuru. Tibet and so-called Xinjiang, which is temporarily part of China right now, it was historically called Uttara Kuru. Even in 19th century maps by German cartographers, it is called Uttara Kuru, this Tibet-Xinjiang region. And the Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan region was always called Uttara Madra. So we had a Kuru Mahajanapada in India, which was south of the Himalayas. You go straight north in a straight line, you go to Uttara Kuru. That was called Uttara Kuru. And we had a Madra Mahajanapada also, whose descendants went into exile into Central Asia. They established Indian kingdoms there. So that part of Central Asia was called Uttara Madra. So Tibet is this huge region. It is mostly empty. And Mao Zedong decided to invade Tibet in, I think, 1950. Yeah, early 1950s he invaded. And the Chinese were doing very badly in the invasion of Tibet. Such a vast territory, the supply lines, logistical lines were overstretched. The Chinese were starving, they did not have food. So what happens? Mr. Nehru supplies them with rice.
During the war.
During the invasion of Tibet,
Okay,
the
during the
attempted Chinese
invasion.
invasion of Tibet, Mr. Nehru sent rice to the Chinese soldiers. That is why they were able to conquer Tibet. You can look it up. I'm not inventing this story. It's
Hindi
all.
Chini bye bye.
So the invasion of Tibet would have failed had it not been for the generosity of Mr. Nehru. Now the Chinese take over Tibet. As soon as they take over Tibet, they start constructing roads through Expansionist, right? To thank Mr. Nehru for his generosity. And Mr. Nehru is told about this. He says, what is the problem? Not a blade of grass grows in this region. So he gives away Expansionist to Tibet, to the Chinese. Then we know the 1962 war happened, which we lost because Mr. Nehru refused the Indian Air Force permission to participate in the war. If the Indian Air Force was flying, the Chinese would not have been able to win so easily.
Is there any justifiable reason for that?
I have spent a lot of time thinking about it. I have found no justifiable reason.
Okay.
What explains this? I have no idea. Yeah, Mr.
And, our soldiers were in canvas shoes that we wear to schools, right? Yeah.
Our soldiers did not have the right equipment. They were freezing. They had those 303 rifles, First World War rifles.
Okay.
The Chinese had machine guns, and still we fought them, and so many of our soldiers
So
died.
even after all this, we could have still won if we used our air force.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Then, so we lost 1962, which is something that it's a debt that we owe the Chinese. We have to pay them back. We lost 1962. They took some territories, Aksachin and so on. In 1967, the Chinese again tried to invade parts of India. There was a war in 1967, and India won the war, but your teachers will not teach you that. Oh, yeah, the media will not speak about this. India defeated China in 1967 in the war. The media doesn't speak about it. Your history textbooks will not write about it. In 1987 to 89, there were more clashes in Arunachal Pradesh, in the Sumdorong-Chu region. India defeated China there again. But again, the media will not speak about this. They want everyone to think India has always lost to China. That is not the case. Now let's talk about China a little bit more. The Chinese have this aggressive mindset. Yeah.
Risk covers.
Yeah, they have this aggressive mindset. They want to bully the ones who are weak. You know what is the characteristic of a bully? A bully is a coward. A bully will pick on those who are weaker than him. The moment you punch him back in the face, they will run. That's the characteristic of a bully.
So
That's what China does. Yes?
Just a second, sir. I just want, if anyone has any questions, so please raise your hands. Our volunteers will come to you with a piece of paper and pen. Those questions will be screened and then given up to me during the Q&A. So yeah, please. So please continue.
Okay. So, yes, the Chinese have an expansionist mindset. They have used the fake history of the Yuan dynasty, which was a non-Chinese dynasty, to make claims on other nations' territories. The last time they tried to fight somebody was in 1979, when the Chinese tried to invade Vietnam. There was a war between China and Vietnam. Vietnam is over here, and they have a significant border with China. The Chinese tried to fight Vietnam, and they lost the war very badly to a small nation like Vietnam. That is the last time the Chinese were involved in a military conflict. The last conflict, 1979, loss to China. Since then, the Chinese have not fought any single war. In the 1960s, the Chinese fought the Russians. The Chinese have a major border with Russia in Manchuria. And somewhere over here, there is an island, the Zhenbao Island, on which the Chinese and the Russians had a major clash. I think it is this one, maybe. Right? The Chinese and the Russians had major clashes, just like the clashes you see along the India-Tibet border in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. The same kind of hand-to-hand fighting and all that. But this escalated. It went into artillery, tank warfare. Hundreds of soldiers died on both sides. And the Russians decided to nuke China. The Russians, under Nikita Khrushchev, was it? Or whoever it was, they decided to nuke China. The Americans found out. And they threatened the Russians that if you nuke China, we're going to nuke you. So the Americans saved China. They saved China's skin. And that led to the eventual America-China rapprochement in the 1970s during the time of Nixon and Mao, right? So the Americans brought China on their side, and eventually the Russians and the Chinese, they settled the border dispute, but Russia does not trust China because they are sensible. Nobody can trust China. So Russia and China are natural enemies because of their common long shared border, and because the Russians know that the Chinese will reopen this border dispute when they think it is the right time. So that is a short history of China, and then the Chinese liberalized and they were able to become a major industrial and manufacturing power, and that's where we are today.
So, one of your videos, you said that India brought civilization to China. So, maybe some light on that?
Yeah, like I said that for 2000 years, we sent lots of teachers, lots of gurus, lots of experts in dharma and dhamma, Buddhist scriptures, Vedic scriptures, all of that. Many of these scholars who went to China were experts in Buddhism as well as Vedic scriptures and all that. And the whole of China, if you look at all of their architecture, ancient architecture, if you see all of their ancient temples, you will see lots of Indian gods, Buddhist gods, all of that. So China for 2000 years has been very deeply influenced by Indian culture. Kung Fu itself has come from India. Today they call it Chinese Kung Fu, but it originates in India. And the interesting thing is that all of Asia's martial arts, they originate in Kung Fu. For instance, in Japan, in the island of Okinawa, there is this Japanese island of Okinawa, over here. Where is it?
Little up, yeah.
Somewhere here. It's one of the major Japanese islands. It is home to Shorin Ryu Karate. Shorin Ryu Karate means Shaolin style karate. So that style originates in the Shaolin school. And various other martial arts like, for instance, what is it called? Taekwondo, etc. also have influences from China. Now, Korea.
Kalyaripattu is...
I have no idea if there is...
Some people say that.
Some people say, what's the evidence?
Okay.
Show me the evidence.
Bodhidharma maybe had the...
That is also conjecture. We don't know.
Okay.
No. I mean, if there is evidence, I'll be happy to accept it.
All right.
Right. So some people say Kalari Payotu and Kung Fu have some relationship. I have seen nothing.
Like mother of Kung Fu is Kalari.
How do we know it? Show me one piece of evidence. No?
Okay.
Yeah. So people say that. People like to try and create these relationships. But thus far, we have found no evidence. Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it is some martial art that has gone extinct in India. India was the home to many martial arts. They have all been wiped out by the invaders in the past 1000 years. So maybe the original martial art has gone extinct.
Very possible, yeah.
So now even through China, what we have is that South Korea, I mean the whole of Korea became Indianized. Korea was a Buddhist kingdom. A Buddhist, the religion was Buddhism. That only happened through China. Then Buddhism went through China into Japan. In Japan, we have something called Zen Buddhism. The Chinese called it Chan. The original word is Dhyan. Dhyan became Chan in China and became Zen in Japan. So Zen Buddhism is Dhyana Buddhism. It's Dhyana. And if you
see Hinduism, there is called Buddhism.
Yeah, so let me talk about that. Yeah, briefly. So if you see the various Buddhist temples in Japan, you will see all kinds of divinities, gods and goddesses, big figures, big statues, murtis of various gods and goddesses with Japanese names. One of the goddesses is called Benzaiten. Benzaiten, she holds a string instrument and she sits on a lotus in a swan. Benzaiten is the Japanese Saraswati. There is also a Japanese Shiva, there is also a Japanese Mahakal, there is also a Japanese Lakshmi, and so on.
Ganesh.
Every single Hindu god or goddess is present in Japan with Japanese names. There is Vayu, there is Ganpati, Ganesh, who is called, I forget the Japanese name. So if Japan was Buddhist, then how come they are worshipping all these Hindu gods and goddesses? Right? Which means it was not simply Buddhism that was transmitted, it was the whole of Dharma that was transmitted to the east from India. So that is in brief about this.
So very brief history of China and Indian influence on it. So we move on to our favorite nation. So you have a very special name for it. It wouldn't sound nice if I say it.
So first of all, Pakistan is an artificial nation, and more importantly, Pakistan is a temporary nation. Yeah, that's what it is.
You have given a newer name. You have given a newer name recently, which is Pakistan occupied Punjab.
All of those territories are temporarily occupied by Pakistan. Sindh is temporarily occupied by Pakistan. Punjab. See, understand the history of Punjab. What is Pakistan Punjab today? just 100 or so years ago, 150 years ago, it was part of the Sikh empire of Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji. Now, how does that become part of Pakistan? The British broke the Sikh empire and they gave Ranjit Singh's empire, most of it, to the Pakistanis. This is completely illegal. This is completely wrong. Pakistan itself should never have been created. Why did we agree to the creation of Pakistan? We in this room have not agreed to it. It is certain people who claim to be our leaders who agreed to this. And who benefited from this is the question.
Father of our nation.
The father of our nation, yes sir.
He actually tried not to, right, agree to it.
You know, there is a difference between words and actions. Indians love words. We love words. We are so impressed by words. Yesterday, Mr. Sharif, whichever Sharif is in power right now, Shahbaz Sharif. So Mr. Shahbaz Sharif goes and says that we want peace with India, and all Indians are celebrating. Arey bhai, shabd hai ye karya nahi hai. These are not actions. Never focus on words, only focus on actions. Indians have been misled by fake leaders to focus on words. So if you come to Indians and say nice words, we will start worshipping that person, even if the person's actions are all anti-India. But the words are very nice. So look at Mr. Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi said that I will not allow partition. Partition will happen over my dead body. So did he put his dead body somewhere to stop partition? What action did he take to stop partition? Nothing. He took no action to stop partition. Only words. Words don't do anything, bhai. This is something Indians have to realize. Words versus actions. If you want to understand the true nature of any leader, completely ignore their words and only see their actions. Then you will see a whole different picture. Whether it is Mr. Modi or it is anybody else from history, only see the actions. One of the greatest things about Shri Chinggis Khan is that he did not write a diary. He left behind no words. Only his actions are visible. So we understand him if we know how to look at history. But there are people like Mr. Gandhi who wrote thousands and thousands of words, and today there is a whole scholarship genre which is Gandhian studies. They are all examining his words and trying to find various meanings, which is a complete waste of time. Just look at his actions. What did he do for India? I have said this on occasion that Mr. Gandhi was a British agent. And if it offends somebody, I would like to apologize to absolutely nobody. Yeah? So, Mr. Gandhi, if you only focus on his actions, it only benefited the British. So we're going to talk about Pakistan. Pakistan is an integral part of this. So we all study the history of Pakistan, how it came to be and all that. But I'm going to tell you a whole different story. A completely different story that nobody has taught you. So understand this. We spoke about Russia, the history of Russia. I spoke about the fact that the Russians lost the Crimean War in the 1850s to the British. Yes, there was a struggle. It was called the Great Game in Central Asia for the ownership and control of the Central Asian region, and the big prize was India. The British held India, but India was thousands of kilometers away from Britain. The Russians were in control of large parts of Central Asia. If they could come to India, they could take away Britain's crown jewel and colonize India themselves. So the key to controlling India was the control of Central Asia. And that was the Great Game. This entire struggle lasted more than a century. The struggle for the control of Central Asia between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. That is something no Indians are taught in history. Okay, so this is the context in which we have to understand what happened. A lot of what happened in Expansionist Tibet also is part of the Great Game, and the Great Game is still continuing in a sense. Now understand why Pakistan was created. When the British understood that they are no longer in a position, see, why did the British leave India? The British had to hastily leave India because of something that happened in 1946. The Great Indian Naval Rebellion. The Indian Navy suddenly, all of a sudden, spontaneously rebelled against the British Crown. Just overnight, the entire British Indian Navy from Aden to Singapore was out of control. And they had all rebelled and they were all demanding independence. Right? And they had put up 3 flags on their ships. They were all coordinating through wireless. So they were all in communication with each other. More than, I don't know how many ships, the entire Indian Navy. And they had put up 3 flags on each ship. One was the Indian National Congress flag, Mr. Gandhi's flag, one was the Muslim League flag, and one was the Communist flag. These were the three main political parties in India at the time, which were supposedly fighting for India's independence. So they put up three flags. Then there was police firing in Mumbai, in Bombay. Thousands of people died. You're historians, your teachers will not teach you this. Thousands of people, the people of Bombay came out on the streets supporting the Indian naval rebellion. The British had them shot. Thousands of people died on the streets of Bombay in 1946. None of your history teachers will teach you this, or your textbooks will not teach you this. There was similar firing in Visakhapatnam, there was similar firing in Karachi. How many Indians died, we don't even know. So then what happens is that Mr. Gandhi says that this kind of rebellion is unacceptable. Okay? And he sends Mr. Patel to Bombay. It was then called Bombay. Now it's Mumbai. Then it was called Bombay. So Mr. Gandhi sent Mr. Patel, Mr. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, to Bombay to negotiate with the rebels. So Mr. Patel comes to Bombay. He enters into negotiations. He says, you need to stop this immediately, and we guarantee you that there will be no repercussions. No action will be taken against you if you put down your weapons now. So these people, they got dejected, and within a week, the entire rebellion was shut down. Immediately, they were all arrested and court-martialed. So Mr. Patel, whatever promise he gave was a lie. Actions versus words, right? So now understand, we'll go further from this, yeah? So because of this, and if the Indian army had come to know what happened, and if the Indian army on Indian soil had also participated in the rebellion, within 24 hours, India was free. Because there is no way the British were able to control India without the Indian army. The British control over India was not because of ahimsa. It was because of the might of the British Indian army. The moment the Indian army turns their back from the British, it was over. So when the British realized they can no longer trust the armed forces of India, that's when they had to hastily withdraw from India within 1 year in 1947 itself. Now, when they were withdrawing from India, there was the possibility that the Russians were already in control. The USSR was up to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, all the way to the neighborhood of Afghanistan, which is the Indian subcontinent. When the British left, if they left behind a unified subcontinent, and if India gave access to Russia to the Indian Ocean, it was game over for the West. Then India will become on the side of the USSR, and there will be a huge coalition and a very powerful coalition and it will give Russia, for the first time in its history, access to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. So they wanted to anyhow prevent this from happening. A unified India would not listen to Britain. So the British created a fake artificial nation divided on the lines of religion, a small nation that will always feel threatened by India if you teach them right things, and they will always be pro-West, pro-British, and that's why this country, this fake artificial nation, temporary nation was created. And if you look at Pakistan's history, it's always been pro-UK, pro-West, and the UK has always been pro-Pakistan. Even today it is pro-Pakistan. Even today the US is pro-Pakistan. This is the geopolitical reason why Pakistan was created. All this, what we are taught, this freedom struggle and the Do Qaumi Nazariya, two nation theory, this is all, it's all cosmetic paint that has been applied to the real reasons why Pakistan was created. So that's what it is. So today Pakistan, we know, it's a failed state. It is a state that is, it's a state in decay. There is no law and order. There is no justice. There is nothing there. In every nation, the nation has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a nation. The army runs the country. And the army is a mercenary army. They serve somebody else. They serve a higher power. Between 2005 to 2019, 20, 21, they were serving China. The Pakistanis were serving China. Before that, they were serving the US. The Americans were financing and funding Pakistani terrorism in India. The Americans financed and funded the genocide of the Kashmiris in the 1990s. All of that was done by the Americans.
Taliban also.
Taliban also to a certain extent. So Pakistan has always been an instrument of the West to destabilize India and to further certain geopolitical agendas. For instance, in the 1980s, when the USSR, in the 1970s, late 70s, when the USSR invaded Afghanistan, they could have easily reached the Indian Ocean if it was not for Pakistan. The Pakistanis stopped the Russians from going further. So it has served the geopolitical purpose it was created to serve. It has nothing to do with the Indian cultural divide and the Hindu-Muslim divide. All of that is just an excuse to create these fake artificial nations to further the Western geopolitical agenda. So Pakistan is always on the brink of disaster. It is a failed state, but it is not allowed to fail because it is important to the West. Right now, just a week ago, they have announced a $10 billion loan or whatever, a package for Pakistan. The Saudis are giving $1 billion. The Americans are giving a whole lot of money. EU is giving money. France is giving money. The UK is giving money, and so on and so forth. Even the Chinese are giving some money. So everybody, all these nations want India to remain off balance by using Pakistan against India. That's the deal with Pakistan.
So, as a youngster who has always seen Pakistan as a unified map, like their map, their state, I think, has Pashtunistan, POJK, then there is Baloch, and then Sindh. Were they all by legally the right to accession? Were they like conquered like that, or?
Yeah, see, listen, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how you make a country. It's usually done by force. But if you look at the technicalities, Jammu and Kashmir obviously acceded to India. And because Mr. Nehru allowed the Pakistanis to take over 1/3 of Jammu and Kashmir, that's why we have POK and POJK, right? When it comes to Balochistan, Balochistan had opted for freedom. They had opted for freedom, and they were invaded by Muhammad Ali Jinnah's army on Jinnah's behest, and Balochistan is under illegal Pakistani occupation. Balochistan actually is a large region. Half of it is in Iran, half of it is in Pakistan. All of that should be free. So if India starts supporting free Balochistan, it's going to create issues with Iran also. That's a story. When it comes to Sindh, there is a Sindh freedom struggle. GA Sindh movement. There were demonstrations last week in Sindh. There is yesterday also perhaps, yeah. So Sindh has always had this sentiment that they want to be free from Pakistan. Punjab used to be Maharaja Ranjit Singh's territory. It never belonged to an Islamic nation like Pakistan. So all of it has been illegitimately.
Pashtunistan
Pashtunistan is a very interesting story. So Maharaja Ranjit Singh, before Ranjit Singh ji came to power, the Abdalis of Afghanistan had taken over Kashmir and these large parts of northern India, not large but reasonable parts of northern India, and they had committed all kinds of horrific atrocities against the Indians. The Hindus, the Afghans, Pashtuns themselves are of Indian origin. They are of Rajput origin, okay? Kandahar used to be called the city of Rajputs before it became Islamized. So the Abdalis and the Afghans had committed all kinds of horrific atrocities against Hindus in northern India. Then the Sikh Empire rose up. The great Maharaja Ranjit Singh liberated this region, and he re-established dharma in this region. He outlawed cow slaughter and much more. Then as a punitive measure, he took over more Pashtun territory. He expanded northward and westward and captured Pashtun territory also, on which he imposed his rule. That was the boundary of the India and Afghanistan boundary, the boundary between Afghanistan and the Sikh Empire. When the Sikh Empire fell to the British made that the boundary between Afghanistan and India, British India. After independence, that is called the Durand Line. After independence, that became the boundary between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the Afghans, the Pashtuns, have always regarded that part which Maharaja Ranjit Singh took as part of the territory because it is a Pashtun majority region. It's called Pashtunistan. So Pakistan and Afghanistan have an open and serious border dispute, and they are not going to have peace. And the Taliban are Pashtun nationalists. They are not pro-Pakistan. They are very deeply anti-Pakistan. This is going to be an issue that will go on.
And as we also know, Jinnah's family did not follow him, right? Wadia.
The greatest failure of Muhammad Ali Jinnah is that none of his descendants who are alive today, he has many, none of them is a Pakistani. His daughter, she chose to be kind to her father and not become Indian, so she took up Canadian citizenship, but she spent a large part of her life in India itself. And her son, Nusli Wadia, is Indian. Her grandson, Nes Wadia, is Indian, and so on. So their entire family is mostly Indian. So Jinnah's greatest failure is that his family did not choose to be Pakistani.
Yeah, so that's where we know temporary nation. So how did they get nuclear power? Did the West help them, or they, as they say, they developed it?
The Americans knew that India had the scientists and the brains to to have a proper nuclear weapons program. India's first nuclear test was in 1974.
Yeah, but we were caught.
So then the West decided that Pakistan needs to balance India in this matter also. So they allowed that guy Abdul Qadir Khan to steal some blueprints from the Netherlands or somewhere of nuclear reactors, centrifuges perhaps, nuclear centrifuges. You have to purify uranium-238 into uranium-235. If you have 90% uranium-235, that is weapons grade uranium. Yeah, there are three natural isotopes of uranium. So the centrifuge is the machine that does the purification. So I think the blueprints for the centrifuges were stolen by Abdul Qadir Khan from the West, but it was done with the West's permission. And the Chinese also got involved in this, and they sent a North Korean nuclear bomb design to Pakistan, and possibly that design was tested in Tibet by the Chinese on behalf of Pakistan. So the Pakistanis essentially have a weapon that is using uranium that is purified using Western techniques, and the design of the weapon itself is North Korean and tested by the Chinese. So that's what it is. All these nations want India to fail. India actually has no real friends, and that's good. We are 1.4 billion. Why do we need anybody?
So we now move on to geopolitics. So this is the history that we have known. Now, what are the repercussions? So let's start with Russia. As just the last line you said, it's so significant in what I'm going to say now. Russia, we are brothers, right? I mean, they have always helped us. Even in the movie Rocketry, they gave us cryogenic engines, they always gave us weapons, they always give us technology. So what's the truth? Are they real brothers or?
Nice way to instigate me, na? Look, we Indians love certain countries, no? We love Russia, we love Israel.
Israel, yeah.
You go to the Israeli Ministry of External Affairs, and you see the map of their embassies in the world, and see the map of India. See for yourself. See what kind of map of India they're showing. Yeah? So, Israel is no great fan of India. We think Israel is our iron brother, we have the same, all that. Israeli culture is Abrahamic culture. It's extraordinarily different from Indian culture. They hate idol worshippers. They hate polytheists. They regard polytheists goyim, which is the Israeli Hebrew word for kafir. Yeah? And so I have spoken about Israel. It's created a lot of controversy. I'll stop there with Israel. Let's talk about Russia. Look, the Russians, they started an annual set of exercises with Pakistan in 2016 and 2017. It was called Druzhba. Druzhba means friendship in Russian. Druzhba. Druzhba 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021. But there was no Druzhba 2022 between Russia and Pakistan. So 1 year the military exercises are held in Pakistan, 1 year in Russia. It is not the act of a friendly nation to hold military exercises with our number one enemy. So if Indians think that Russia is our best friend, you have to once again, look at the actual facts. Now, in 2022, for some reason, the exercise did not happen, because in 2022 they really needed India. Yeah. So Russia, see, every nation looks out for its own national interest. Every nation prioritizes its national interest over everything else. These are the principles of Vishnugupta Chanakya, and we have to understand that. We are from the land of Vishnugupta Chanakya, but we are so delusional. And we are so naive. We think Russia is our best friend. There are no friends in geopolitics. There are temporary enemies and there are temporary allies. But everything is temporary. Please read the Arthashastra. Read what our great Guru Shri Vishnugupta Chanakya told us. The most naive population I see in the world today is Indians. That too coming from the land of Vishnugupta Chanakya. Israel is not our friend. Israel is cooperating with India because it suits them. They stand to gain money from it. They were trying to first woo China in the 2000s and 2010s. The Americans stopped them from doing it because the Americans own Israel. So the Americans prohibited the Israelis from selling sensitive technology to China. Otherwise they would have done it. They already sold the blueprint for the Chinese JF-17 Thunder, the fighter plane, to China. It was an Israeli design that they sold to the Chinese, right? The Israelis wanted to sell much more to China, but the Americans stopped them. So now they have turned to India. Obviously, we have certain shared interests, our national interests align to a significant extent. So we are working together. And obviously it's for mutual benefit. There is no friendship in this. It suits us, it also suits them. That's why we are working together. We are developing missiles together, we are working in cybersecurity together, and other things as well. Similarly with Russia, for some time Russia was looking to Pakistan. For some time, Russia is also cooperating with China right now. But Russia is also scared of China. So that's why they need India to counterbalance China. So geopolitics is a very complicated and complex affair. There are no real friends, there are no permanent enemies. Permanent enemies are those with whom you share a common border. Those are permanent enemies. And that's why when it comes to China, the solution, the long-term solution to the India-China issue is for India to somehow find a way to free Tibet. If we free Tibet, there will be no more a boundary between India and China, and then relations can go back to the normal of the past 2000 years. As long as the Chinese occupy Tibet, we are going to be enemies and permanent enemies. Right now, India is not in a position to free Tibet. Eventually, we will be in the position. And that's why the Chinese don't want India to progress, and the West also doesn't want India to progress.
So what should we do? Like, we have to first get CCP out, but before that we need to increase our GDP.
So if we want to get rid of the CCP, if we want to engineer some kind of regime change in China, first of all, we have to become strong ourselves. Right now, we are a small economy. I mean, we are not, we are a great power now. The events of 2022 made India a great power. We have been able to neutralize the Chinese Communist Party to a certain extent. We have been able to prevent Russia from becoming a Chinese slave, because we started buying enormous amounts of Russian oil, which is why Russia has been able to secure itself, and other reasons as well. So India is now one of the great powers. India is no longer a middle power. India is not by any means a superpower, but India is one of the three great powers. India, Russia and China are great powers. The US is a superpower. But we should not be content with where we are. We have not reached even 2% of our potential. We have to first find a way to, as soon as possible, as rapidly as possible, reach the 5 trillion annual GDP mark, then the 10 trillion mark. Once we are at 10 trillion, our military strength will grow proportionately. And once you are at the 10 trillion mark, it's kind of hard for anybody to try and mess with you. So that's what needs to happen first. Then we can look at other things. Of course, everything has to happen simultaneously in parallel, but the main focus has to be the Indian economy.
So coming to China now, how has COVID helped them or destroyed them?
Yes, COVID has been, even I used to call this virus the Wuhan virus, right? It originated in Wuhan, but at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, whom did it help and whom did it harm? It has destroyed the Chinese economy. It has destroyed the Chinese manufacturing. The Chinese manufacturing has stopped, more or less stopped. The exports have crawled to almost a halt. The GDP is contracted. The Chinese GDP is now showing negative growth. They are trying to say it's 1%, 2%, 3%. It's actually negative. They have always been lying about their GDP numbers for the past 10 years. But the GDP is now contracting. There are these horrific lockdowns in China, and there's nothing they can do about it. The prime reason is that their vaccine is absolutely useless. We think China is this high-tech superpower. They were not able to produce a vaccine that works. Its efficacy is less than 10%. If you look at all the vaccines, COVID vaccines, the Indian vaccine has been the best thus far. And the figures bear this out. Our scientists have developed the best vaccine. The Moderna vaccine is not as good as the Indian vaccine. The Pfizer vaccine kills more people than it saves. And the Chinese vaccine is like a water shot. Nothing happens. And that's why the Chinese are in a deep, deep, deep mess. This pandemic, the past 2.5 years have ruined China. China was on track to become a superpower in the next 10, 20 years, by 2050. They had this big Belt and Road Initiative, this big infrastructure development program, trillions of dollars they were spending in it across Eurasia. They had the Maritime Silk Route, which was going to create this big network of ports that will help China connect it to Africa and all that. Everything has stopped. Everything has stopped. All the construction of infrastructure has stopped, and now nobody trusts China. Nobody wants to work with China. Only poor nations with dictators will work with China, nobody else. So COVID has destroyed China's aspirations to become a superpower. And now they are no longer on track to... See, earlier they were supposed to surpass the US by 2040 or 2050. By today's growth rate, China will not catch up with the US by 2067, if at all ever. But India could become a $30 trillion economy by 2050, 2060. So now India is the big threat for the West. The West has been ruling the world according to its whims and fancies. They control the global financial system. If India wants to earn, let's say, $1 trillion, we have to trade with the world. And we have to earn $1 trillion US dollars. If the US wants to earn $1 trillion, they have to print the money.
Yeah.
They control the printing press. So the Americans have been using this free money to subjugate the world. Now India is the big major threat. And now the Americans may want to use China to counterbalance India and use Pakistan to counterbalance India. Right now there are negotiations happening between the Americans and the Chinese, quietly, not in the big public eye. So that is what's happening right now. So the Chinese ambition to become a superpower has been derailed. The Russians have been saved by India because India started importing enormous quantities of Russian oil. So the Russians did not have to go begging to China after the Ukraine war when all the sanctions were hit upon them. So the Russians have been saved by India. Now India and Russia have to work together to counterbalance China, and then let's see how it goes. It's a very complicated situation, but that's where we are.
Yeah, lots of countries are trying to sign up to BRICS now. So
Yeah, BRICS is interesting. Many countries want to be part of BRICS, but as long as India and China are enemies, BRICS is not a stable organization.
So there is no more a threat that you used to speak before the war, that they might, start a small war to destabilize the government, but now it's not beneficial.
Oh, no,
it
no,
seems
no.
like that.
You know what? The interesting thing about China and the US is that when it comes to India, they have the same feelings. Okay. The Americans would like to see the Modi government fail in the 2024 elections. They would like to see a weak government come to power so that they can manipulate India. The Chinese also want to see the Modi government fail in the 2024 elections. They would also like to see some coalition government or some weak leader come to power. So, one of the ways of achieving this is by inflicting a hypothetical military defeat on India. And the Americans will not start a war with India, so they would like the Chinese to start a war with India. Some small, short, sharp war, maybe along the Siliguri region. If the Siliguri region is a very short corridor, right? So if the Chinese are able to take that over, then they can cut off Northeast India. That would be perceived by the population as a humiliation and a failure of Narendra Modi. And then 2024 could go the wrong way. So this is a very important year for India. It's a very political year, and it is a possibility that the Chinese may try some stupid misadventure and try to start some short, sharp war with India. That still exists. The threat still exists. Especially when China is not doing well, they will want to divert the attention of their population to something external.
Similar to what Tawang happened.
Could be something like that, yeah.
Okay. So the last question on geopolitics from my side. You say Pakistan is a temporary nation, but they are a nuclear power. How long do you think we will take to make them permanently temporary?
Right. So Pakistan has always been propped up by the West. Right now, last week, they have given a $10 billion begging bowl package to Pakistan. So the West does not want China to fail. They want China to, Pakistan. I mean Pakistan. The West does not want Pakistan to disintegrate. They want to keep it there in order to counterbalance India. So right now, the West is more powerful than India in our neighborhood. The West is more powerful than China because China is still not able to take Taiwan. The US is genuinely a superpower. They are way more powerful than anybody else. So I would say that the next 10 years, India has to build up its economy and military. And once we are at a certain tipping point, maybe in 10 years, then Pakistan could possibly see something happening there. Maybe 10 years or so. Yeah, I cannot give an exact figure, but maybe 10 years.
Maybe 10 years, okay. So now we move on to Q&A. I have some 5-6 questions. We'll try to move quickly through them. First question is, what would have happened if Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was the first PM of India?
Right, so Mr. Patel was, we have to understand Mr. Patel was a Gandhian. He was a firm follower of Mr. Gandhi, but he was a realistic person. He understood the threat of China, and he did not believe in the socialism of Mr. Nehru. So I believe that India would have gone on a better, stronger trajectory under Mr. Patel. the Tibet invasion by China would possibly not have happened. It may have failed. The Indian army could possibly have gotten involved. India could have had stronger economic growth, not like the Nehruvian rate of growth until the 1990s. So overall, it would have been a
What
better
is
thing.
Nehruvian rate of growth?
The Nehruvian rate of growth was the Fabian socialistic policies that Nehru implemented in India, which saw India's economy grow at 1% or 2% or 3% per year for 20, 30, 40 years.
That's what developed countries do normally.
Yes, a nation that is that was in the position of India should have grown at 10, 20% per year for the first few years, you know.
The follow-up question to that is Akhand Bharat possible?
Akhand Bharat is a work in progress. Eventually, what is Akhand Bharat? It is the whole Indian subcontinent, including Sri Lanka, including Nepal, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, Balochistan, even the Iranian part, and
Does Myanmar come in it?
not really.
Okay.
We don't need to have all of it inside. So Akhand Bharat doesn't necessarily need to be a single entity. It can be a coalition, a civilizational state instead of a nation state. But the problem is the radicalized population in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, right? So Akhand Bharat is a work in progress. Maybe in 100 years, maybe our descendants will do it. We need to be patient. Our plans are measured in centuries. We are not a temporary small nation state. We are a 10,000 plus year old civilization. A century is nothing for us. So we are a link in the chain, and we have to do our job. And we have to educate the future generations so that they will do the right things. But I think within 100 years, we could have it.
So it's very important for us जो हमें अपने संस्कार देने हैं next generation को. Next question is, can we rewrite our constitution, the holy book?
I'm sure we can. You know, we need to have a strong enough leader. I'm not saying the current leader is not strong, but the strengthening of the process needs to be better. We definitely need a new constitution, a dharmic constitution. A constitution must embody the civilizational values of the culture it is supposed to be about. It has to embody our cultural values. And our constitution is not doing that. It is an Abrahamic constitution. It is a Western constitution. It is a copy-pasted constitution. Understand this. When the Americans came up with the constitution, their founding fathers wrote the constitution, the framers of the constitution, and then the constitution was put to a vote. There was a referendum. The people of the US, the rich white men, they were given the choice of accepting or rejecting the constitution. In the case of India, the constitution was never ratified by the people of India. It says we the people, but we the people have never voted for it, whether we accept or reject it. And the people who framed the constitution did not represent the wills and the aspirations and the hopes of the people of India, because they were chosen from 13% of the voting population of India, and that election was held under foreign occupation. So the entire constitution of India is illegitimate. It has never been ratified. It does not represent our culture. So we need a new constitution, and when a strong enough leader comes to power, this will happen.
So the next question is, who introduced Islam? I am assuming in India. So
It was the Turks. So there were these waves of Turkic. The first invasion that had an Islamic element was the Arabic invasion of Muhammad bin Qasim in the 8th century or so. It was from the west. It came through Persia. The Arabs had conquered Persia and destroyed Persia. And then they tried to invade Sindh. It was moderately successful, but overall a failure. So that was the first attempt. And then for several centuries, there were waves of Turkic invasions from the northwest, through the Khyber Pass, through Afghanistan into India. They first took over Gandhar, and then slowly, over many centuries, they were able to make inroads into India. So it's the Turks, the Turkic tribes that introduced Islam into India.
So there's a small request, the kind of question it is, can you talk more about 1967 war with China?
The 1967 war with China was a rather brief war. It was not a well spread out war like the 1962 war was. It was a short, sharp war, and the Chinese were defeated very rapidly and very soundly. I myself do not remember. There's a whole book about this. maybe I should delve deeper into it. So that's as much as I can tell you right now.
There's a question. You say China could try a misadventure this year. At the same time, you say China is a coward. Isn't that a paradox?
The Chinese believe that they are superior to India. The Chinese believe that they know that they have 3 times the economy of India, which means that they have much more military firepower. And a coward is one who attacks when he thinks he is very strong, and who thinks that the person I'm attacking is weak. So if China tries to attack India now, it is the move of a coward because they think they are strong and we are weak. But obviously it is a stupid thing to do because we have certain weapons that they don't want to taste. So what I said is correct. They are bullies and they are cowards.
But chances are India will win that?
I think the Chinese will be defeated very roundly, very badly if they try something.
Because what general perception we people have is that India is very weak against China.
So the Chinese have not been tested in battle since 1979. The last war was in 1979 and they lost the war to a small nation called Vietnam. Secondly, their military positions in Tibet are exposed. There is no forest cover or anything there. Everything is visible from satellites. We have satellites that can see everything that's happening in real time, including in bad weather, including at night. So we know what the Chinese are doing. We know where their military installations are. They are within easy range of our missiles and our bombers, our fighter bombers. And the terrain is such that it gives India an advantage. Because our soldiers, the Indo-Tibetan border police, the various acclimatized forces, etc., they understand the region very well. The Han Chinese, they come from thousands of kilometers away in Tibet, and they are not used to the terrain and the climate and the weather and the altitude of Tibet. And also the supply chain, the supply routes of Tibet, of China, are very long and they can be easily cut off by India. So because of all these things, India has a significant advantage when it comes to fighting China in the Himalayas, and I believe India will win very easily against China, and it could be like a disaster for China if they do this.
So will they try, if it comes to their own existence, like CCP's existence, will they try a nuclear?
I don't think India should try to eliminate the CCP's existence. India should simply defeat the CCP in Tibet.
They will remove them themselves.
And then the people of China will see that as a defeat, as a humiliation. The Chinese do not tolerate failure. The Chinese public does not tolerate failure. You look at 2000 years of Chinese history, whenever a dynasty fails in military conflict, they are overthrown. So if the Chinese try something and they fail, it's going to be a disaster. We don't have to do anything more.
And that's the same thing with Russia, right? They are okay with cruel leaders, but they should be winners. They don't tolerate kindness, but
Yes, the Russian history is very hard. They are okay with hard leaders, cruel leaders, but they don't tolerate failure. Leaders must succeed. So that's the deal.
One follow-up question from myself. How did they rapidly ramp up those industrial outputs, Russia?
So it's not something that happened overnight. They had an industrial base that goes back to the 19th century. All right. So they had the industrial base. They had the technological know-how. They had the scientists, the technicians, the engineers who knew how to do this. And because of the war, there was this enormous war effort, war industry, ammunition, weapons, howitzers, tanks, incredible numbers of fighter planes, bombers. So all of that machinery is what sustained the war. So all of that was then repurposed into civilian industries. So the entire base was already there. And they were able to leverage that in a very efficient manner after the Second World War was over. That's how it happened.
And in between Russia and Ukraine conflict, who should India support?
India's official position
from a very non-political Indian citizen, youngster, because we are very used to be.
Yeah. So from our perspective, not getting into politics, it is beneficial for us if Russia comes out on top. Because the entire system is rigged in favor of the West. It is impoverishing the rest of the world, including India. The US is propping up Pakistan. It may in the future prop up China against India also. The Americans funded Pakistani terrorism in India for decades. The Americans are funding Ukraine now. We have to understand there are reasons for this. If the Russians fail, then the Americans will re-establish their complete domination and hegemony over the world. Russia, if you look at the map of Russia, it covers the whole of northern Eurasia.
Mackinder?
Yeah, Mackindor's theory. That's the heartland. the Russian territory contains at least 50% of all the natural resources in the world. If the Americans get a hold of that, they will rule for another 500 years. We need a change in the way the world is run. The American Western capitalistic model is destroying the planet. You have mountains of plastic in the oceans because they are using the oceans as a trash bin. They have destroyed North America. They've genocided the population. 100 million Native Americans dead. Forests wiped out. They are now fracking it, and they will eventually do that to the whole world. We need a different kind of world order, maybe eventually one that is led by India through Indian values. And it begins in Ukraine. So Ukraine is an attempt by the East to start a parallel world order, which eventually, hopefully, becomes a whole world order. And we cannot have the Russians imposing their order on the world or the Chinese doing that. Eventually, it has to be India. But it has to start with Ukraine. So for that reason, I would say that Russia needs to prevail in Ukraine. It's already prevailing. You know, Indian media blindly copies the West. If you watch Hindi news channels, it's like the Ukrainians are reporting there. They are just giving you word by word Hindi translation of what the BBC and CNN and all that is saying. What's happening in reality is very different. But the Russian media has been completely censored from social media and from everything else. So we don't quite know what's happening, and we are being made to believe that Russia is losing, and they've been losing since February last year. Well, they're still here. See, what makes you think Russia is getting weaker? Yes, and they have resources. They have 50% of the world's natural resources. They have as much oil and gas as they will ever need for the next 100, 200 years. They have a population. They have 300,000 reserves that are now being put into the war effort. They are recruiting more reserves, and they'll be trained. They also have the weapon systems. They have tens of thousands of missiles. They have everything. The Western media wants us to believe that Russia is failing. It's not failing. By now, it would have failed otherwise. Well, they are there, and now there's something else which is going to happen soon.
Sir, one last question for all the youngsters, which is not related to the topic. Romanis, can you please, because something very Indian connection to it.
Right, the Romanis are also known as the Gypsies. So if you look at, when you think of Spain, Spanish culture, you think of flamenco dance, flamenco music. The flamenco music is Romani music. Who are the Romani people? So about 1,000 years ago, the Turkic invasions of India began. And there is this mountain range in Afghanistan. It was in Vedic times, in old times, called the Upari Siena mountain range. Siena means falcon. It's a raptor, it's a bird of prey. It looks like an eagle. So the word for falcon in Sanskrit was Siena. So these mountains were called the Upari Siena mountains, which means they were so high that even the falcons could not fly that high. Right? And that word in Persian is now called Shaheen. Siena became Shaheen. Now, these mountains are now called the Hindu Kush mountains. It means the killer of Hindus. The reason is that these Turks, they used to take tens of thousands of Indian slaves out of India into Central Asia through the Hindu Kush. And that mountain range is so called that incredible numbers of Hindus died there. That's why it's called the Hindu Kush. So incredible numbers of Indian men, women and children were taken as slaves for various purposes. We know what the purposes are. They were taken into Central Asia. You look at Central Asia, lots of people look like Indians today. You look at the Arabic countries, so many people look like Indians today. Look at Yemen, they all look like Indians. Saddam Hussein looked like an Indian. His sons look like Indians. You know, why is it so? They all have Indian matrilineal lineages, not patrilineal lineages. So Indians were taken as slaves in enormous numbers into Central Asia. Eventually what happened is that they realized that they took too many Indians there, and they did not need so many Indians. And most likely they did not want to slaughter them all on their territory. So what they did is that they set them free and ordered them to go westwards but not back eastwards into India. That happened about 1,000 years ago. And ever since then, these people who are called the Romani, they have been wandering around Europe, and they have been subjected to all kinds of horrific atrocities and racism, which happens even today. So Romani people in Europe are Indian origin people. Most of them look like us, yes, Their language is called the Romani language. It is classified as an Indo-Aryan language. If you listen to it, you will actually understand some of it. Yeah.
So
And
they also went through Holocaust.
they went through the Holocaust.
Same way Israelis went. The Jewish people. Went.
Yes. So the Nazis tried to exterminate the Romanis too, which is strange because the Nazis claim to be Aryans, but the Romanis are the real Aryans, the Indians. Yeah. Anyhow, they tried to eliminate the Romani people. I would say at least 1 million Romanis would have been killed in the gas chambers by the Nazis. Yeah. And the Jews refused to recognize the Romani Holocaust. There is this Nobel Prize winner called Elie Wiesel, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. He is a Jewish person. He was a Jewish person. He's dead now. So there was a Holocaust memorial in the US which was being built, and Elie Wiesel refused to allow recognition of the Romani genocide in the Holocaust memorial because he was of the opinion that the Jewish are special people and the Romanis are not. Romanis are inferior.
Color of the skin.
Color of skin and Indian origin.
And sir, personalities.
What personalities?
Romani personalities, Romani.
Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was Indian origin, Romani. If you know Led Zeppelin, their main singer Robert Plant, he has blonde hair but he's Romani. Zlatan Ibrahimovic, Eric Cantona, Robert Ballack.
Michael Ballack, the German.
Michael Ballack, yes, of course.
Cristiano Ronaldo.
Cristiano Ronaldo, most likely, yes. Pablo Picasso, Elvis Presley, Yul Brynner.
Einstein.
Einstein was a Jew. Einstein was a Jew. There are so many of them who are even today afraid to say that they are Romani because there is this stigma attached to them. There was this guy. See, one of the major Romani families in the UK is the Blythe family, Blythe, Blythe. Some of them emigrated to the US. There was this guy in the US whose name was William Blythe, okay? He is still alive. His mother, so his father was Blythe. This boy's name was William Blythe. Then his mother married a different guy whose surname was Clinton. So William Blythe became Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, the president of the US, he also has Romani blood. There are so many of them in Europe. Most of them we don't even know. Lots of footballers in the European leagues, many of them are of Romani origin. Many musicians and artists and actors and singers are of Romani origin. Many politicians, at least one former president of Brazil was of Romani origin, and so much more. They have contributed so much to European culture, especially music. Flamenco music is Romani music. It's not Spanish music. Now it's called Spanish music. So yeah, that's the story of the Romanis.
So basically, whoever you think they look slightly Indian, doubt it.
Possibility that they may have Romani.
Doubt them, yeah. Okay, so here we end.
That was our interaction with Abhijit sir. इसमें हमें तो बहुत मजा आया. हमने बहुत कुछ सीखा, समझा और बहुत ज़्यादा वैल्यू पाया. आई होप आपके लिए भी ये सेम एक्सपीरियंस रहा होगा. हम हर महीने एक ऐसे ही वीडियो लाएंगे विथ अ बिग अमेजिंग स्पीकर. तो प्लीज लाइक, शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू दिस चैनल, and we will see you in the next video.